Ever wonder how much influence money should have in politics? It's a question really that's been debated for decades, and today we're diving into a case that sits right at the heart of it, Buckley v. Valeo.
Yeah, this isn't just exactly the goal to prevent corruption or even just the appearance of it, this idea that, someone could essentially buy a politician.
Right, makes sense on the surface.
Yeah.
But here's where things get interesting. Senator James Buckley and the New York Conservative Party, among others, weren't too keen on these new rules.
They weren't happy.
They challenged the law, claiming it trampled on their First Amendment right to free speech.
And they weren't alone. The case quickly became a battleground for, one of the most fundamental tensions in a democracy. How do you balance the right to free speech, including the right to spend money to amplify your message, with the need for fair and ethical elections?
It's a tough one.
It is.
And this is where the Supreme Court comes in, right? They had to decide.
Right.
Could the government actually regulate something as fundamental as free speech in the name of fair elections?
Yeah. Big question.
Their answer, as you'll hear, wasn't so simple. So the Supreme Court is faced with this huge dilemma. Free speech versus fair elections. What did they do?
Well, they did what often happens in these really complex cases. They didn't, draw a hard line one way or the other. Instead, they kind of broke the issue down, looking at different types of campaign spending and how they relate to free speech.
Okay, so unpack that a little. They didn't just, say yes or no to the government regulating campaign finance.
Exactly. They got into the weeds. For example, remember those limits on individual contributions? We talked about how much money one person could give directly to a candidate. The court actually upheld those.
Wait, hold on. They were worried about free speech, but okay with limiting how much someone could donate. Why?
Because the court, they bought the argument that large contributions could lead to corruption, or at least create, the perception of it. Imagine a scenario where someone could give a massive sum of money directly to a candidate.
Right, are they just buying their vote?
Yeah, it raises questions about whether that candidate is now, beholden to that donor. Does that sound like a fair election?
Okay, that makes sense. So they were trying to prevent someone from essentially buying influence. But what about spending in general? How could they say it's okay to limit donations, but not how a campaign spends its money?
That's where it gets really interesting. When it came to limits on how much a candidate could spend on their own campaign, the court came down on the side of free speech.
So let me get this straight. The court essentially said, go ahead, spend unlimited amounts of your own money to get elected.
Well, it wasn't quite that simple, but in essence, yes. They struck down those spending limits, arguing that spending money to amplify your message, is a form of political speech protected by the First Amendment.
Interesting. So my ability to get my message out there is directly tied to how much money I have? That feels a bit uneven.
It does, and that's been a major point of contention ever since this ruling came down. The court was trying to balance competing interests. They were okay with limiting direct contributions to prevent corruption, but felt that candidates should be free to use their own resources to speak to voters directly.
And this is all about that balancing act, that tension between free speech and fair elections.
Precisely. And to make it even more complex, they also addressed something called independent expenditures.
Okay, what's that?
So this is money spent to support or oppose a candidate, but not coordinated with the candidate's actual campaign. Think of it like this. I could decide to run a bunch of ads supporting you for office and spend a ton of my own money doing it, all without ever even telling you.
Wait, really? That's allowed? Seems like a giant loophole.
That's one way to look at it. The court drew a distinction between coordinating with a campaign, which they saw as potentially corrupt, and this independent spending, which they viewed as pure political speech, In their view, trying to regulate that would be like trying to regulate someone's opinion.
So Buckley v. Valeo didn't exactly solve the problem of money in politics, did it?
Not exactly. In some ways, it opened up a whole new set of questions and challenges that we're still grappling with today.
It's kind of wild to think, a case from nearly 50 years ago still has such a huge impact on our elections today.
It really does, yeah. Buckley v. Valeo, it's considered a landmark case for a reason. It essentially set the rules of the road for how we deal with money in politics, and it continues to spark debate and controversy even today.
Which makes me think about that provocative thought from the outline. We talked about the idea that unlimited spending could create, an uneven playing field. But what about the flip side of that? Could there ever be a situation where limiting spending too much actually ends up harming democracy?
That's a really, really interesting question. And it gets to the heart of this whole, balance we've been talking about this whole episode. On the one hand, right, if you restrict spending too much, you run the risk of like drowning out less established voices. Think about, someone who's new to politics, maybe someone without a lot of personal wealth who wants to challenge, like an incumbent with high name recognition. Strict spending limits could make it incredibly difficult for that newcomer to get their message out there.
Totally. It's almost like trying to compete in a race where, one runner is wearing lead shoes or something. They might have like the best ideas, the most compelling message even, but they just can't keep up.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why this whole debate is so complex.
Yeah.
There are strong arguments to be made on like both sides. Ultimately, it's about finding that sweet spot where we protect free speech rights without like allowing money to just completely drown out the voices of everyday citizens.
Where do we go from here? What can we learn from Buckley v. Valeo, and how do we ensure our elections are both free and fair?
That is the million-dollar question. Buckley v. Valeo, it gives us like a framework, but it also leaves a lot of questions unanswered. One thing is clear, though. We need to keep talking about this issue. We need to keep pushing for transparency in campaign finance so voters know who's trying to influence their vote. And we need to keep demanding that our elected officials, that they find ways to reduce the influence of money in politics without, stifling free speech in the process.
It's about finding that balance, right? That sweet spot you mentioned
That-
earlier. And, it's up to all of us to stay engaged, stay informed, and keep those conversations going.
Absolutely, yeah. Because when it comes to our democracy, we all have a stake in ensuring that it's truly representative of the people, not just those with the deepest pockets.
This deep dive into Buckley v. Valeo has been, well, it's been eye-opening, to say the least. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the initial challenges to the law to the court's, nuanced ruling and its lasting impact in our elections. Remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation, really. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those critical thinking caps on. Until next time.